Okay, so good morning and welcome to the November meeting of the Children and Family Scrutiny Board. My name is Councillor Alan Lamb. I'm the chair of the board, and to start off with, I'm going to go through and ask all of our members to formally introduce themselves in alphabetical order. So if I can start, please, with Helen Bellamy.
Hi, good morning. I'm Helen Bellamy. I'm a teacher representative.
Marvellous. Councillor Bithell, please.
Morning all, Councillor Hannah Bithell, representing Kirkstall.
Thank you. Kate Blacker.
Morning, Kate Blacker. I'm the primary school's parent governor representative.
Thank you very much. Tony Britton, please.
Good morning, I'm Tony Britton. I represent the Roman Catholic Diocese of Leeds.
Thank you. Do we have Councillor Drinkwater? I'm not sure if he's on the line yet, so we'll come back to him. Councillor Flynn, please.
Good morning, Billy Flynn, Councillor for Adlam Wharfdale.
Thank you. Celia Foote, please. I can see
Sorry
Celia.
about that.
Oh, there you are.
I was trying very hard. Good morning, Celia Foote. I'm a teacher representative, not an IT teacher.
That's very reassuring to know, Celia. Thank you. Councillor Forsyth, please.
Good morning, Councillor Anne Forsyth, Farnley and Wortley Ward.
Thank you. Andrew Graham, please.
Good morning, Andrew Graham, representing the Church of England Diocese.
Thank you. Councillor Gruen, please.
Good morning, Councillor Caroline Gruen. I represent Bramley and Stanningley Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Hussain, please.
Good morning, everybody. Councillor Arif Hussain, representing Gibson and Hare Hills.
Thank you. Councillor Illingworth, please.
Good morning, Councillor Illingworth from Kirkstall Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Lennox, please.
I think that's me, but you broke up a moment there. Councillor Jess Lennox for Crossgates and Winmore.
Thank you very much. And I accidentally, not deliberately, left out Councillor Howley.
Okay, I'll believe you. Chris Howley, Councillor for Wheatwood.
I do apologise, Councillor Howley. It wasn't. I don't know why I ticked you off in advance. Councillor Kidger, please. No, I'm not sure if Councillor Kidger's with us yet. Councillor Marshall Catton, please.
Good morning all, it's Councillor Abigail Marshall Catton representing Little London, Woodhouse and the City Centre.
Thank you. Debbie Riley.
Good morning, Debbie Riley. I'm co-opted member for Children Looked After and Care Leavers.
Thank you. Good morning. Councillor Renshaw, please.
Councillor Karen Renshaw representing Alzey Robin Hood Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Stevenson, please.
Morning, everybody. Ryan Stevenson, Harewood Ward.
Thank you. Jackie Ward, please.
Good morning, I'm Jackie Ward and I represent the secondary parent governor representatives.
Thank you. And then we've got two officers supporting us as well this morning. So if I could ask Angela, please, to introduce yourself.
Morning, I'm Angela Brogden, the Principal Scrutiny Advisor to the board.
Thank you. And Harriet, please. Harriet, are you there?
Sorry, Chair, I think Harriet might be just having a few connection issues at the moment.
Okay, no problem. Well, we will crack on. So we go straight into the agenda. So I would normally go to Harriet, but I think I'm going to Angela instead to ask if we have any appeals.
There are no appeals, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Any items that we need to exclude the press and public from?
There are no items for exclusion, Chair.
Thank you. Do we have any late items this morning?
There are no late items, Chair.
Thank you. Then do any members have any declarations of disclosable pecuniary interests? No, not seeing any hands go up. So then, any apologies, Angela?
No formal apologies have been relayed, Chair.
Okay. I would like to just note to the board this morning that due to other work commitments, unfortunately, Emma Holmes has taken the decision to step down as the board's Young Live Leeds representative. And so we're awaiting a further nomination to take her place on the board, hopefully by the next meeting in January. So on behalf of the board, with your permission, which I'm sure you'll all give, I intend to write directly to Emma to thank her for her contribution to the work of the board, because she's been a very valuable member, and it's quite understandable with other commitments. She can't continue, but I'll make sure we acknowledge that contribution for her. Okay, so moving on, we're on to item 6, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. So can I have, this is for the 7th of October, so can I have a couple of people just to say they're an accurate record? Watching for any hands going up. Councillor Renshaw, Jackie, Councillor Stevenson, thank you very much. And then are there any matters arising anyone would like to raise that we're not covering on the agenda? If you'd use the hand raise function, if there are. I'm not seeing any. So in that case, we can move on to our substantive item for today, which is the Future in Mind Leeds strategy refresh. So we've got a number of executive members and also some officers. So I'm just going to go through and ask them to introduce themselves as well. So if I could start with Councillor Venner, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Councillor Fiona Venner. I'm the Executive Board Member for Children and Families. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I understand Councillor Heselwood is covering for Councillor Pryor this morning. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, please, Councillor Heselwood.
Yeah, Councillor Julia Heselwood, Deputy Executive Member for Learning Skills and Employment.
Thank you. Good to have you with us this morning. And if you could pass on our good wishes to Councillor Pryor and hope it's nothing too painful. Julie Longworth.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Julie Longworth and I'm Deputy Director for Children and Families.
Thank you very much. Val Waite, please.
Good morning, I'm Val Waite. Yes, apologies, just a little bit late coming in there, Councillor Lamb. I'm Val Waite, I'm Head of Learning Inclusion.
Okay, thank you, Val. Karen Jessup, please.
Morning, I'm Karen Jessup. I'm Principal Educational Psychologist and SEND Support Teams Lead.
Thank you. We have Dr. Jane Mishenko.
Morning, everybody. I'm Strategic Lead Commissioner from NHS Leeds CCG for Children and Maternity.
No, thank you. Thank you for joining us this morning. And then we have Jess Evans.
Morning, everyone. Jess Evans, Senior Commissioning Manager for Children's Mental Health and Wellbeing at Leeds CCG, working with Jane Mishenko.
Thank you very much. Good to have you with us. And are there any other officers that I've missed off the list? I think we've got everybody. So good. So also just to note that Sal Tariq has sent his apologies this morning, but Julie is filling in for Sal. So I think I'm going to hand over to Councillor Venner to do an introduction to the item, and then Jane will give us a further briefing before Jess takes us through the presentation. So Councillor Venner, it's over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really delighted to be introducing this item. This is my particular area of love and passion, having worked in frontline mental health services for such a long time. What I'm most proud of about Future in Mind is that it really does deliver. And to give you an example, in my previous role as Chief Executive of Leeds Survivor-Led Crisis Service, I sat on the crisis subgroup of the Future in Mind board, which I now chair in my current role. And we identified in the crisis subgroup that there was a huge disparity in mental health crisis services for children and young people compared to adults. So there was nowhere like Dial House, no crisis team in children's services like there is in adult mental health services. So children and young people in mental health crisis were just ending up in A&E because there was literally nowhere else. So the CCG commissioned a crisis team that now operates in CAMS, and they also commissioned Team Connect helpline and Safe Zone, which is a face-to-face service. Both of those are delivered jointly by the Marketplace and Leeds Survival Aid Crisis Service. The voice of children and young people is paramount in Future in Mind. We're very guided by them and their lived experience. We have MindMate ambassadors who are 16 to 25, who are young people with personal experience of mental health issues. We also have some very cute mini MindMate ambassadors who are at Hare Hills Primary School, who do a lot of work around challenging stigma around mental health. And 1 year, our last children's mayor was from Hare Hills Primary with a manifesto that was about mental health. This refresh is really timely. It's recognised locally and nationally that the impact of the pandemic is falling incredibly heavily on the shoulders of children and young people, not least the mental health impact. And so we're very much drafting this strategy in that context and with an awareness of the impact that it's having on children and young people. So I just want to draw your attention to a few particular highlights of the strategy, and then I'll hand over to Jane. So transitions, which means transitions between CAMHS and adult services, is a priority in this strategy, but also in the all-age mental health strategy. And this is a hugely important issue. This has been a problem the whole 25 years I've worked in mental health services, in terms of young people falling down the gaps between CAMHS and adult services. It's better than it used to be. It used to be the case that CAMHS services stopped at 16 and adult services stopped at 18. So there was literally a chasm people fell down, which isn't the case anymore. But nevertheless, that transition often does not go well and has had some incredibly tragic consequences here in Leeds and in other parts of the country in terms of young people ending their own lives. At the OBA event on young women's mental health that was in February, we heard some incredibly distressing, powerful testimony from parents who'd lost young adult children. So the transitions is a huge citywide priority that we're putting a lot of energy into. There's also reference to trauma and the impact of trauma. It's just fantastic that this is now becoming mainstream thinking, that trauma has an impact on mental health. To give you an idea of the prevalence of trauma survivors that are in the mental health system, at Dial House, which is Leeds Survival Aid Crisis Services face-to-face crisis house, in any year, abuse in the past or present, rape and sexual violence are presenting issues in 60 to 68% of visits. So the impact that trauma, very commonly different forms of abuse, have on adult mental health is profound, and it is really critical that services are trauma informed. And so it's right that this is a priority within the strategy. There's also reference to poverty, which is woven throughout the strategy. In Leeds pre-pandemic, 35,000 children in Leeds lived in poverty. The Children's Commissioner estimates another 300,000 children nationally have been pushed into poverty as a direct result of the pandemic. And that's the cause and a consequence in terms of poor mental health. So that's woven throughout the strategy as a context in terms of children and young people's mental health. This strategy is very much a draft. So I'm really pleased with bringing it to scrutiny at an early stage, because we really need your input in terms of, have we got the priorities right? Are there things you think we should be focusing on that we're not focusing on? So with those comments, I'll hand over to Jane, and I'm really looking forward to being able to discuss this with you later. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Venn. That was a brilliant introduction and really brought it to life in terms of the impact. So we're here to discuss two key items that are very interwoven. So I'll begin with just building a little bit on Councillor Venner's introduction in terms of the strategy refresh, and then hand over to Jess, who will talk about the impact COVID is having on the mental health of children and young people in the city. And we're presenting it like that because very much the strategy refresh has to take into account the impact of COVID, the kind of the immediate, but also the longer term latent need that is built. So I suppose one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is the strength of the partnership and working together that embeds this strategy. So this is not a single agency strategy. This cuts across education, health and social care, and involves children and parents and the third sector really working together to both develop and deliver this strategy. And it has very wide reach as well. It begins from absolute infancy, in fact, before birth, in the Best Start priority, recognising the importance of the 1001 first days of life. And it goes right through then to the critical age of transition that Councillor Venner talked about. It goes from prevention, how do we prevent mental health needs developing, right through to specialist support for very critically ill children and young people. It's from a base of that's nationally an underinvestment in children and young people's mental health. Over the last 5 years, we have achieved a lot together, but we are really in recognition that there is a lot more to do, and I do want to emphasise that. But it's good to recognise where we have got to. We do have now the MindMate website and the MindMate resources and school programmes and the fantastic MindMate ambassadors who really help shape everything that we do, whether that's service or resource development or the content of the website. As Councillor Venner said, we've got a children and young people's crisis offer, which is brilliant, and there are plans to get that to be 24/7 as well, that Jess is very involved in. We've got now a dedicated community eating disorder service. We're part of the Trailblazer sites that have teams working with further education colleges. We have the MindMate Spa that joins up the service offer in the city. And we've had the significant council investment in the specialist school provision for pupils with social, emotional, mental health needs. So there have been some significant achievements, but as you'll see with with the content of the paper that I'm sure you've all read, as we've looked at the data, we've engaged with children, young people and families, parents, and heard what we still need to do. There are significant areas of development still required. And we have our 7 priorities, which are on page 22 of your paper pack, I believe. Some of those connect very strongly with the all-age mental health strategy that Councillor Venner mentioned, particularly transition, where we absolutely need to have joint leadership and ownership and work together, and where we need to not just tinker around the edges, but really transform the service offer in the city for our young people as they're from 14 to 25 is the cohort we're looking at, and we're already gathering intelligence, and we'll be really starting intensely working on that priority from April. The other one is the impact of trauma, which Councillor Venner also highlighted. Absolutely critical that we do this work. We know the impact adverse childhood experience has, not just on children and young people, but throughout the life course. And what we want to do is to have a city that is trauma informed in all the settings and the communities, as well as having a really good service offer. So services that are trauma informed and able to offer support. That's a significant piece of work that we've already started working on as a partnership group. There are some areas that are, such as prevention, that's always been a priority and will continue to be a priority. We absolutely have to do everything we can to prevent infants, babies, children and young people developing mental health problems in the first place. Support is a priority where we must get the children in need supported as early in their life and as early in the life of the need and problem as possible by the right person first time, so that they're not bouncing around the system. Absolutely critical that we reduce weights and we get support quickly, and particularly when in crisis. Inclusion, we need to work together for those really vulnerable pupils who have social, emotional, mental health needs as part of their SEND needs, and really get our integrated pathways working. And that already we're starting on that work as well. There's been really strong feedback from parents and carers that they need to be more involved, they need to be more supported, and we do recognise this. And they need to feel like they're part of the team. They're an absolute essential resource that we need to be working with. And absolutely critically, we need to be recognising and focusing our energy resources on those young people who have greater health inequalities. There's some really significant areas. We know those pupils with SEND, we know those pupils who don't live with their family or live in a family where there is dysfunction, or who are living in poverty, have significant more mental health needs. And we need to be recognising and working with that. So I'm going to stop there. So we'll have lots of time to have conversation and discussion, but I'm going to pass over to Jess, who's going to talk through the slides about the impact of the pandemic. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Jane. So I think Angela's going to share her screen so that we've got the slides up. And then Jess, you are kindly going to take us through the slides, and then once I don't know if your preference is that we take questions as we go through, or if you'd just like to go through the presentation and then we can deal with all the questions at the end.
Thank you, Chair. My preference would be to take questions for all of what we've spoken through at the end, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely fine. Yeah, I'll keep track of if people indicate through the either through the chat or raise their hand, and then I'll bring them in at the end. So over to you, Jess. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Jane, and thanks, Councillor Venner. So, as already mentioned, the impact of COVID on children and young people's mental health has been significant. We know that nationally, through the national reports that have told us. We know that in Leeds as well, and there's a disproportionate impact on children and young people, as Jane mentioned, with health inequalities, those living in poverty, and children from Black and minority ethnic communities. So we did a piece of work that looks at how the future healthcare needs of children have been impacted by changes made to meet COVID-19 demands. So essentially, the impact of COVID on non-COVID patients. So children that haven't had COVID, but may have had pre-existing mental health conditions, or the circumstances have led them to become unwell. And I'm going to talk you through the 6 key findings, and I'll talk a little bit about what we've started to do to address those. As Jane has mentioned, and as you'll have seen in the paper that was pre-circulated, the impact of COVID is a key principle that overlays all of the 7 priorities we have in the Future in Mind strategy refresh. That is, all of the work that we're doing under those 7 priority areas, we must take into account this work and the impact that COVID has had on children and young people throughout all of those 7 domains. So to start off with, what we did notice was during the first lockdown, there was a decrease in the referrals to the MyMate single point of access. And a lot of that is because a large proportion of those referrals come from GPs. Fewer people were presenting at their GPs. A number of reasons for that, as we know, fear of accessing health services, and the way that GPs were running appointments. That significantly reduced in March to May, and self-referral numbers also reduced as well. What I will say is, alongside that, what we did notice was in our third sector services, so Teen Connect that Councillor Venner mentioned, and our Safe Zone support service, which as a safe space launched in the midst of lockdown, so did telephone support. Numbers there were consistently high, and people were still accessing. So whilst they weren't presenting in what we would define as typically kind of health services, the third sector services were being well used, which is a real positive we took from that. So the indication was the need was still there, and potentially this was suppressed as well as children and young people weren't in school. What we did do was we planned for a surge in referrals once schools reopened in September. And we have noticed that referrals have now returned to normal levels. So what I can say is for October of this year, the referral numbers were almost identical. There was 2 differences between that in October 2019. The need is obviously being identified and referrals are being made. So they're back up to normal levels, and there's been a staffing increase within the MyMate single point of access as well. That was already planned before COVID and before lockdown, but that has all been actioned so that all those referrals and any surge can be dealt with. We noted there was probably potential for an increase in waiting times, and in particular in our MyMate Wellbeing Schools cluster-based support services and community CANs. This was the consequence of how we changed staffing around at the start of lockdown. We actually predicted that referrals would increase rather than decrease into the MyMate single point of access. So we moved staff there to be able to deal with what we anticipated. And because what we anticipated didn't happen, what we were able to do was clear a large number of referrals that were waiting to be triaged and passed out to the relevant services. And this means that there was an increase of children and people whose referrals have been passed on to MindMate Wellbeing and community CAMHS. School closures potentially exacerbated this issue because there's a real opportunity for early intervention within schools, and with children and young people not attending school, there could have been some missed opportunities. To address that, we have passed across some funds to the MindMate Wellbeing Service to address the waiting lists that happened as a consequence of this. And community CAMHS have changed their model and introduced an assessment and brief intervention model with a dedicated team to allow children to receive quick and brief interventions to reduce lengthy waits for community CAMHS. We noticed an increase in neurodevelopmental referrals. This is referrals to CAMHS for assessment for ADHD or autistic spectrum conditions or both. Referrals were averaged 105 a month from April to September 20. In the last half of 2019, we're averaging 49 referrals per month. This is a national picture, so this is increasing nationally. Because of the way neurodevelopmental assessments are carried out, some of that activity was paused at the start of lockdown to make sure that when it did restart, it could be safe. And restarting that and doing it in a COVID secure way impacts on the numbers of children and people that are able to be seen because of the need for specialist PPE and the required space and the space in between appointments. What I can say is that Leeds Community Healthcare and the CAMHS service have made a significant investment into the neurodevelopmental assessment, and so that they are going to ensure that everyone is seen more quickly. We noted an increase in risk presentations into our crisis outreach service during lockdown, and some of that potentially would have been contained by the community if changes hadn't been made due to COVID. We noticed an increase in self-harm and suicidal thoughts, both seen at Cooth and Teen Connect, and again that reflects the national picture. As I mentioned, Teen Connect calls increased and CAMHS crisis calls decreased, but we did notice that young people were presenting were those that were children looked after, and the 16 to 18-year-olds presenting more frequently. As I've already said, that reflected national trends. We noticed our eating disorder referrals reduced by about 50% during lockdown, and following that there was a sharp increase, and the increase was a greater proportion of urgent referrals, again reflecting the national picture. What I can say from that is that all our eating disorders referrals were seen within the required nationally mandated timeframes. So the eating disorder service has dealt effectively with that increase in urgency and the increase in referrals coming through to them. Next slide, please. And last but not least, what we did see during lockdown, and particularly from April and actually due into September, was a decrease in referrals to the Infant Mental Health Service. We know that nationally from the Babies in Lockdown report, it's been a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on those pregnant, giving birth or at home with a baby, toddler or very young child. And 25% of those parents reported concerns about their relationship with their baby, and about 35% of those would like to seek help. 61% of parents have shared significant concerns about their mental health, and we know that does have an impact on children's mental health. This is something we need to be mindful of now, but also moving into the future. These are very young children at the moment, and obviously we'll have to see how the impacts on their development. We know that now, moving into October and November, referrals to the Infant Mental Health Service have started to pick up and increase, and notably due to health visitors increasing their contacts that obviously were still available during lockdown, but those face-to-face contacts being resumed. What we are noting from those referrals is that there is an impact of the restrictions that have been throughout maternity services and people's traumatic birth experiences impacting on how they're bonding with their baby, or how they feel they're bonding with their baby and their parenting. Parents, carers, so women and their partners, reporting being robbed of their parenting journey and a lack of joy, and having a marked anxiety and uncertainty about the lack of socialisation opportunities for their babies and their very young children, and what the impact of that might be. So that is something that we're working closely with the Infant Mental Health Service about, to monitor and start to understand as that starts to develop and as those referrals start to come through, and we work with those families. Next slide, please. This is a graphic to show you in relation to point 1. This is the referrals into our MindMate single point of access from September 19 to September 2020. And as I mentioned, you can see there the real decrease during the first lockdown, April, May, June, picks back up in July. We always have a dip in August with it being summer holiday and schools being closed. Obviously, they were closed for a very long time this year. And I can say that the trend has increased from October to into November as well. So that's far it's still increasing, which is a positive because the needs being identified. Next slide, please. And I've already talked through some of the actions, but broadly speaking, these are the actions that have been taken to address those impacts. So we've increased our communications. We did some specific communications out through our social media channels, through GP and primary care community channels, social media campaigns using the radio as well as online, with a widespread message for children, young people and families. We've made significant improvements in the MindMate website and how you can navigate that. And we're exploring a citywide digital service offer. We've given additional funding, as I've identified, into eating disorder services, the development of an overnight crisis line that Jane Mishenko mentioned, and the MindMate wellbeing service to reduce waiting times. We're looking at development of a service to support young people and children who have experienced trauma. We're using data to shape a future service provision and inform our next steps. We do that constantly, and as I've talked about, this work will be weaved into how we work through those 7 priorities in the future of Mind Refresh. And this includes, but isn't limited to, responses from children in the My Health, My School survey completed on return to school, which gives us a real wealth of real-time information. And of course, we're refreshing the Leeds future in mind, and we're looking at focused work through that on the neurodevelopmental pathway. So that's not just the assessment, it's the whole pathway, how we support children through school, through early identification and right through to diagnosis and beyond. Health inequalities, in particular, I've mentioned the impact of poverty and children who are from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, and increasing our range of high quality parent and carer support. That's all my slides complete. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share that with you.
Thank you very much, Jess. So I think we're moving into questions, comments, and general discussion. It's been a very interesting presentation. So I don't have any indications of questions yet. So who'd like to go first? Got Councillor Renshaw, please.
Thank you, Chair. There's quite a number of things that went through my mind when listening to the slides. I'm wondering if there's any increase in the school referrals and the identification and support that's there. And it said normal levels of mental health issues, but that was based on national figures, not the figures within Leeds, as far as I could work out. And same with the eating disorders. So I just wondered if they were identifying the mental health issues within schools now, or whether they were doing more of catch-up work, and not all are always aware of mental health issues of young people. So I wonder if there could be a little bit more elaborate now they are identifying those mental health issues, because while they've been in lockdown at home with families, there's been an increase in number of struggling families who have developed some mental health issues over that period of time. So I just wondered how they were handling those sorts of situations within our city. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Renshaw. Who'd like to respond to that, please?
I'm happy to respond in the first instance, Councillor Lamb.
Okay, go ahead, Julie.
I suppose I would just say that what we really have seen throughout the beginning of the pandemic and right into lockdown is the value and the benefits of, just as Jane has said, that partnership work, that multi-agency work, but right at the local level. So within our clusters, you know, so our colleagues in education, in health, in the children's centres, early help, those specialist services, really coming together to identify and to positively identify children and families where mental health has been an issue. You know, I think as Jane and others in the meeting already have said, we had a number of children and families who were experiencing mental health prior to the pandemic, and clearly we've had to really monitor their well-being and their progress as a partnership. But we had other children and other families who were vulnerable and who were perhaps on the cusp of, you know, having some of those social, emotional, mental health problems. So again, I would just say that there's that close partnership work, that sharing of information, that ensuring that somebody within the partnership, you know, and the person who has the relationship with the family, be that a health visitor, be that a children's centre worker, be that the teacher, has their eyes and their ears, you know, in relation to the child and the family. So, you know, as colleagues have said, you know, it has been a particular issue in lockdown, but it's also been a real particular focus of our attention. I think the other thing that I would say is that some of the learning that we have had as that partnership during the lockdown, so in relation to multidisciplinary working, you know, what we've seen is where we've brought professionals together from different backgrounds, from different disciplines. That's been really, really rich, you know, in terms of, I suppose, being able to identify the specific issues for children and families, but also the best response in terms of an evidence-based response. We've learned a lot in terms of flexible deployment of our staff, as an example. So we have set up multi-agency restorative support teams, pulling together colleagues from health, colleagues from the children's centres, colleagues from early help and family support, and they've had a particular focus, I think this has been referenced already in the meeting this morning, on parents, new parents, young parents who were at particular risk of isolation and poor mental health during lockdown. But I'll stop there for now, Councillor Lamb.
Thank you. I think Val wanted to come in. I'll bring you back in, Karen, once Val spoke.
Yeah, I'll come in first, and I'm sure Karen
Val,
will.
are you there?
Yes, can you hear me now, Councillor?
Yes, I can.
I think there's some delay. On the feed, so apologies for that. And I'm sure that Karen will want to come in and talk specifically about the work that Learning Inclusion has been doing and the support teams. One of the things added on to what Julie has just said is very much alongside working with the individual families and the individual needs that are being identified, and whether they need additional support that is done on a personalised level, is the whole work that we've been doing, which is at the school level, and actually supporting the school and the staff that are within the school to have a whole school approach. Because just as Julie said, a lot of that is about relationships and about how we can have consistency in the support then, rather than somebody coming in, doing a piece of work and intervention and moving away. It's very much, how do we build that skill, that knowledge of the school itself, so that they can have a whole school approach, they can work with all of the children within the school, and then those that are still stuck, we can then, you know, look at those individual children, what in addition to those need, what can we then put in place to support them. I think it's also worth saying that our area inclusion partnerships have been working through the entire period. So whilst schools were just open for vulnerable learners, all of those partnerships also were supporting all of those families, vulnerable learners, going out, checking in with families, also delivering food parcels and supporting. And they are now still open for all of those children and are supporting schools, whether it be outreach work or individual, again, personalised support for those families. I'll pass over to Karen now.
Yeah, I was just going to, thank you, Val. I was just going to say that Councillor Renshaw, that is absolutely crucial. I think what you're saying, going back into school is actually a protective factor. And I think that the impact, the social, emotional and mental health impact of COVID is being mitigated by a return to school and the support to families and support the communities give, and it is that connection. There is a lot of the young people, for example, at the SEND partnership, there was a takeover yesterday at the partnership board, and the young people presented to us and said going back into school was supporting their social emotional needs and their mental health and their well-being. There's a lot of work that's also going on. We've got some DFE grant money that's coming, and the educational psychology team and the learning inclusion with other partners from clusters, from early help and from the Healthy Schools team are supporting delivery of training to give additional support around recognising and identifying social emotional wellbeing needs and mental health needs. And there is some ongoing sustainable support that's going to be delivered into the next year as well. And that's aimed completely at what you're saying is supporting that understanding and identification of need, but really also recognising that we want to support the workforce who have daily contact with those children, young people, to really understand what some of those issues are, what the barriers are, and what is within their provision and their relational approaches that they can do to support these young people to overcome some of the barriers. The national picture and the evidence base is that for most children, young people, it has been really difficult, and they've said that to us. But actually, for the majority of children, young people, the return to school, the return to some of these activities and relational approaches and having that contact is actually a protective factor and supporting. There is still a group of children, young people whose mental health needs will need to have a more targeted approach. But having this universal offer and supporting capacity building and the understanding of the workforce has had a really strong impact.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Renshaw, did you want to come back?
Yeah, please, Chair, because I think all CCGs throughout the city work different, and so you can't sort of generalise what actions have been done citywide. And I do think that even with the teenagers, especially who have not known whether or not exams were going to go ahead or weren't, there'll have probably been an increase in the number of young people there who will have required support. But it's getting the families and the children to not stay in denial about the fact that they've mental health issues. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we need to address, and that's what concerns me. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Renshaw. Did anyone want to come back on that?
I'm happy to come back.
Yes.
Sorry, then I can see James wanting to get in. I think you're absolutely right, Councillor Renshaw, and I think it's that whole issue of destigmatising mental health. That mental health, is something that's going to impact on us all. At some point or another, we're only human. And there's so many challenges in life, let alone the pandemic and the isolation and everything that brought. And I think for me, that's why I think that focus on communication, and how we get those messages out in lots of different ways, whether that's through digital platforms, things that we know will engage young people and will engage families, to sort of, as I say, destigmatize and encourage young people to talk about mental health generally, and all that entails, but also so that they do know where to go, should they feel that they are suffering or that they are having challenges, that they know that it's okay to talk about it, but most importantly, they know who to talk to about it. But I'll hand over to Jane.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't seem to find my hand. So apologies. So I'm kind of waving or I'll type in chat. So yeah, absolutely. It's how do we've done a lot of work to try and tackle the stigma, but there's still obviously more to do and more to kind of raise awareness. And there's different ways that we do that. We definitely have done a lot of campaigns through this period on social media to really encourage people that the NHS is still open, we're still there for you, please contact. We've had our MindMate ambassadors expressing how they're feeling and some of the things that they're doing to help and where to go if you want to access help. So we're certainly doing that. I just wanted to reassure Councillor Renshaw, though, there is only one clinical commissioning group now in Leeds. I know we used to have a few, and that could be quite challenging at times, but we have just the one. And we all work together. And as Karen said, it's incredibly important to recognise the protective factors that are in the city, and clearly the universal offer of being able to go to school is one. Karen and I participated in a podcast. So some young people were talking about their experiences of COVID, and then some professionals were kind of responding to them and reflecting. And the young people was absolutely fantastic. They were recognising some of the difficulties of not being able to see their grandma or not being able to see their friends at college, etc. But also about the opportunities that they took and the strength that they had, the additional time that they had with it. So it was really balanced. They had a really balanced perspective. So I suppose I would like to emphasize, as Karen did, that it's very difficult for all of us going through the pandemic. We are all experiencing, impacts on all of our moods. Most with protective factors, whether that's family, community, friends or school, will get through this and they will be resilient, but there are some that are more vulnerable. Those that are already vulnerable, that are living maybe in a family where their needs are not always seen, maybe where there's a bit of family dysfunction, there's abuse, etc. That's where we're anxious, that's where their needs will escalate. Hence there's been all the partnership working to really identify and support those families. So, sorry, I've probably taken too much airspace. I'll shut up now.
No, that's fine. It's such an important issue, Jane, and I've got a very lengthy list of people who want to chip in, which is absolutely fine. Jess, were you wanting to come in?
Just to elaborate a little bit more on Jane's point about reducing that stigma and that being part of the prevention work that we're doing as we move into the strategy refresh. Obviously, we've been doing that all along, but we are, just to reassure you, working with the MindMate ambassadors who, as Jane has mentioned, and young people through the podcast who've told us their experiences, and they're helping us shape our campaigns. We know from our children and young people's health needs assessment what the barriers that are faced by certain young people in certain communities within the city, and how we need to tailor the support to address that. And we are currently planning a big campaign across social media to go over the Christmas holidays into the new year, branching out into the use of things like TikTok and Instagram, because that's where the young people have told us that it's a good place to reach lots of young people.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Heselwood, did you want to come in?
Yes, please. Apologies, I'm having a few connection issues. So thank you, Chair, for bringing me in. Officers have said quite a lot about schools. So as I was trying to get in, so thank you very much. I just wanted to back officers up and just obviously reiterate that the relationships that we have in schools are key to identifying some of these issues, and we really do need to build on those existing relationships we've got, which we're doing. It's so important. As someone who's taught in FE, and I know other councillors and members of the board are teachers still, you do see that you do pick up on issues in the classroom, and you do pick up on issues with young people in schools, and it's really important that we build these relationships, and the schools and the support services that work in schools are key to developing this strategy. So I just want to say thank you to the schools for that, and the work that officers are doing with schools, because it is so important that we involve schools in this strategy and build this further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So I do have a lengthy list. I'll go through in order that people put their hand up. I think I've got everybody either through the chat or the hand raise function. So Councillor Gruen's next, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for the report and the presentation. I found them absolutely fascinating and very informative. So I really welcome the paper in front of me and the opportunity for this discussion. Really important area. My first comment is about the 7 priorities, which I'm sure are the right priorities. I'm not an expert, but I'm sure they are. Personally, I would have probably placed transition ahead of the others, because I think that chasm that was spoken about earlier on is really important. And I'm interested to know what the kind of practical plans are for improving transition and what will actually happen on the ground. My second point is that you've talked a lot in the presentation about referrals and referrals increasing in number, which is good, awareness being raised, stigma being reduced, all of which is really good. And again, in reality, how long is it between a referral and somebody actually receiving whatever support or treatment they require? And finally, looking at the funding section, the resources section of the report, a not insignificant amount of money is going into this very important project, and really an indication of what impact you feel that will have over time in terms of measurable outputs, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gruen. Who'd like to start there? I've got Jess, please, and then Jane.
I'm happy to take the first 2 points, I think, and then hand to Jane, if that's okay, Jane. So just to pick up your point around transition and where you would have placed it ahead of the others, we've numbered them, but we haven't numbered them in order of priority. So I suppose for us, there's an equal stance for all those 7 things, and actually those will be what we're working on. And I can talk to you about the plans and the structure of how we're working that through. So obviously, as been mentioned by Jane, they're draft priorities, and we're welcoming your comments today. And that's a really important point that you've just made about the importance of transition. And we would share that and agree with that point. We are in the process now of taking each of those priority areas in turn and working those through on a month-by-month basis, bringing together. We've had a working group that's worked up this strategy, as mentioned in the paper, and now we are taking that working group and adding the relevant people from across the system that work with us, commissioners, providers, young people, parents, carers, to help us work on each of those 7 priorities. We reckon, and we're doing that, as I mentioned, month on month in the working group. We mentioned that we recognise that transition is really important, and as such, we are addressing transition in that working group every month from now right through to when we launch the new strategy in March time, and obviously that work will then continue. In terms of the work that's being done at the moment, what we are doing is bringing together what we know from our engagement that's informed those priorities, and what we know from the work that the all-age mental health strategy is doing. As mentioned, there's an overlap, particularly for the transitions and trauma work. We have noted that and from the OBA event on young women's health that was carried out earlier in the year, that presentations of young people in that transitions age range at crisis services is one of our key areas of concern. The age range we're talking of is 14 to 25-year-olds. So our focus initially will be how we ensure that the crisis services are appropriate and easily accessible for that cohort, and how do we enhance that offer and ensure that we've got the right things in place. At the moment, what we're doing is understanding those presentations and that data. As you can imagine, we've got a lot of mental health services, both in children, young people's and in adults, and that age range spans both of those, to understand what that activity is like across the system, how young people are using those services across the system and dipping in and out, and what the opportunities are for preventative measures. We will then bring a working group together. As I mentioned, our working group for the Future of Mind is already talking about that. But we're meeting regularly with the senior responsible officers for the all-age mental health strategy as well to address that. And then we will start to tailor our approach based on the engagement and that work and what the data tells us. In answer to your question about referral to treatment times, it does depend on the nationally mandated NHS referral to treatment times, and there are 2-week timescales and 12-week timescales. It does depend on which area of service that you are going into. And I will note that for the CAMS Leeds Community Healthcare Services, the referral to treatment times and the current live waiting times are available online on their website, so they're easily accessible there. I'll pass to Jane.
Thanks, Jess. That's really comprehensively answered. Thank you, Councillor Gruen. I think this is really important too. This is really important strategy. All 7 priorities are critical. In terms of the resources, actually what you see within the paper is not all of that's not all of the resources. That's just the CCG investment. And what we really need to see reflected within the paper and in the programme is the full partnership resource, because this is delivered by the whole partnership. And so at the moment, it's just specifically about CCG investment for the purposes of this particular paper when it went to Health and Wellbeing Board, first of all. So it's just to kind of make the point that actually there are significantly more resources invested in this programme that is just mirrored within the paper. And in terms of delivery, we need more resources invested, and there is a commitment. So we've made a commitment as a CCG to invest more. We're particularly wanting to invest more in the trauma priority. And the other thing to reference, I'm sure you've all seen, is that the Chancellor has made reference to another £500 million to be invested into mental health. And it's all very high level and not detailed, and we're not quite sure when and how we'll get it, but it is referring to investment for going into schools and for specialist children and young people services. So we'll be really looking on the outlook for opportunities to bring that investment into Leeds, of course, to help deliver our programme. In terms of how we measure, we have a dashboard that kind of says how are we heading in the right direction, as well as obviously looking at feedback constantly looking at feedback, working with Youth Watch, for example, to get feedback from children and families about how they're experiencing services. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. I think Councillor Venner wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make a general comment about funding, that as is referred to in the report, mental health services have historically been very poorly funded. They're often referred to as Cinderella services within the health economy. And various governments have had rhetoric about the need for parity between physical and mental health, but actually that's rarely manifested. There isn't parity between mental and physical health. One of the reasons that crisis services have had increased focus in the last few years is a piece of legislation that came in 2014, which was called the Crisis Care Concord Act. It's really rare that I will praise other political parties, but this was an excellent piece of legislation from the coalition government, and it was a requirement nationally that each area of the country had to demonstrate that people in mental health crisis got the same access to timely, compassionate, effective crisis care as people in physical health crisis. It was a statutory requirement, so each area of the country had to have a crisis care concordat action plan. And the expansion of Leeds Survival-Led Crisis Service and other crisis services around the country is a direct result of that piece of legislation, which required areas to provide funding and required areas to develop mental health crisis services. So that's the level at which you need a commitment to mental health. And it may happen nationally in that there is a recognition nationally that the mental health fallout of the pandemic is huge and is particularly falling on children and young people, as I said in my introductory comments. And there is a lot of campaigning at the moment from councils, the Local Government Association, the Children's Commission, children's charities about the desperate need for increased funding for services for children, and both around poverty and mental health in particular. But it's a long-term issue that mental health services for adults and children haven't had an appropriate proportionate level of funding compared to services that relate to physical health crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Venner. And Karen, did you want to come in on this point as well?
I just wanted to add that, and just to reinforce the aspect that it's a social, emotional and mental health strategy. So we are trying to make sure that we are that we are tackling the issues of stigma and making sure that prevention and support at an early stage is really important. But also for those young people who may be showing their distress and showing their struggle in a different way, where it's not in a mental health field, but is in a social, emotional, mental health. And the example I would give would be self-harming. One, there are children, young people who are self-harming by taking high-risk behaviours out in the community that are actually taking, these highly risk-taking behaviours, whether it's through a range of different, I won't go too much into it, but I think that we're making sure that those services, how do we make sure that we're offering the support at the right place where they're able to access it and where they're willing to access it. So when we're talking, and the question I know is around from referral to treatment, a lot of the evidence base for those young people especially are around having a different approach. The resource that's coming in from places like the Learning Inclusion Service, that's having a look at a joined up support across our clusters, are working with some really complex cases that have got complexities within their family, complexities within their school. They're showing these levels of distress. They're showing they're struggling by not attending within their exclusions. Within all of that aspect, I think that we are putting resource into that and an awful lot, because out of the children identified with social, emotional, mental health needs, in the learning part, we're looking at the roughly 4,500, I think it is, Val. Val will probably be able to have the number, but it's roughly that level. Plus, we've got children and people who are showing social emotional mental health needs, who have got additional needs such as learned intellectual disability, learning disability and autism. So it's quite a big cohort of support that other services are putting in. And I don't think it's reflected, like Jane was saying, in there. And I think it would be really helpful at some point to be able to find a way to reflect it, because the request to services like mine are massive. But actually, so is our focus on this. And so is our real focus on making a difference and actually putting support. I know that Val has done a lot in learning inclusion to put structures in place, having a look at, we've got a vulnerable learners lead who has just started, and that is a real key for us to go across the partnership to make sure that we're also really committing to it.
Okay, thank you for that, Karen. So we're covering a lot already, and I think we're going on to question 3 now. Councillor Flynn is next, please.
Thanks, Alan. It links in actually with what Karen Jessup has just been talking about. Within children and young people with mental health problems, there are specific groups that have higher levels of mental health issues. Children who are in care, children with learning disabilities in particular, physical disabilities, and the LGBT community. I'm sure it'll have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 business over the last sort of 8 or 9 months or so. But I just wondered if you, this is for the CCG, children and families and adult social care, whether you're confident or reasonably confident that you're actually picking up all of the issues that are affecting these more vulnerable groups. For instance, in the first lockdown in Yorkshire and Humber, there were a lot less children taken into care than there had been previously, which run against the what had been happening in sort of previous years. Obviously, because there weren't the same safeguarding measures in place in schools because children weren't in schools. I'm not quite sure what the position's been later in the year, but I'm sure it's been challenging. And not just the support that they're getting now, or ensuring the support they're getting now, but in the transition from children to adults. Whether they are getting the support that perhaps that they're not in a position to ask for themselves because of the vulnerability that they actually have. Sorry, it went on a bit there, but I think you get the point.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Flynn. Who would like to respond to that, please? Jane, go ahead.
I'll make a start. There's quite a lot in there. So I suppose, just reflecting back on the presentation that Jess gave, I would say that there was a period when definitely needs were not picked up because children and young people weren't in school. The country was in lockdown. People weren't accessing primary care, so GPs, which is a normal route in terms of referral to My Mate Spa. So you get your referrals from an identification and referrals from a school perspective, and then you get primary care GPs. So that wasn't happening during that initial lockdown period. And there was a lot of concern across the partnership, and there were lots of COVID system calls, etc., that took place across the system about how we work together, which Julie kind of referenced in terms of those that where there's an information, making contact with those families, dropping off food, checking out how they're doing, etc. Similarly, all of the NHS staff were reviewing their caseloads, prioritising, making contact. So although they weren't doing face-to-face, they were doing telephone. It's not the same, of course. So and COVID did create additional pressures. But then since there's been the kind of the resetting, I won't say it's normal, but the kind of the re-establishment of services, some face-to-face, some still telephone or digital, the referrals have been picking up again, and needed, that latent need has been identified, but it has in certain cases increased, it's escalated during that time. So that's that bit. Now, happy to let somebody else come in further. But in terms of the transition, that's why it's a priority. We aren't confident it's absolutely sorted, no. So both the crisis end, because that's definite urgent, we need to sort that out, that is a priority, but we also recognise that those with who are in care, who become care leavers, etc. We work closely with our colleagues for that cohort, and for those that have learning difficulties. So there is some statutory kind of wraparound for them, but we know it's not, there's more to do together, absolutely.
Okay, thank you for that. So I've got Julie and Val who've both indicated. So Julie, do you want to go first?
Of course, yeah. Again, I think that's a really well made point, Councillor Flynn. I think some of the cohorts of children and young people that you've referred to there are absolutely the young people that we have really had a focus on during this whole pandemic. So we're thinking about care leavers, thinking about young people who are perhaps living semi-independently, thinking about young carers, thinking about young people who were previously at risk of child exploitation, and actually what has that meant as we've gone into lockdown, and perhaps the threats in terms of social media, etc. So there has been an absolute focus on those young people. I think something that's referenced in the report, and something that Jane and colleagues have talking about this morning, is I suppose the plans around really trying to develop more trauma-informed services, if you like, and across the partnership. So we're really thinking about what services do we have in place at the moment in relation to early help, all the way up, if you like, into sort of adolescence on the edge of care, and that point of transition that we've talked about. And what we know is through our own experience of some of those evidence-based services. So one of the things that we've rolled out in children's services has been formulation. So really coming together, again, as a partnership, using multidisciplinary approaches to work out, to analyse, to stand back and analyse, using evidence-based approaches, what we actually think is going on for this young person, and their family, and recognising that think family approach. So there's a lot of work and a lot of planning actually going on at the moment in relation to us developing and continuing to develop those services, where we recognise that children, young people who have had those adverse childhood experiences will be acting out or behaving in such a way, when actually, and I suppose people could think that the problem, or the issue is with the young person, as opposed to actually, understanding what has gone on for that young person in terms of their experience and their life experiences, and how best we can respond to that as single agencies, but also a partnership. So I suppose I would just want to emphasise that is, as it's been set out in the plan and in the priorities, that is an absolute key focus for us as we go forward, because we do know that there are children, specific cohorts of children who will be more susceptible to poor mental health, and we need to be on the front foot with that and taking a real proactive approach. I'll stop there, Councillor Lamb.
Thank you, Julie. And Val, did you want to add to that?
Yes, please. Absolutely, Councillor Flynn. Our ongoing interest in those that are extremely vulnerable, those with special educational needs. And I think some of the information that we have just heard this morning, as from Jane and from Jess, in terms of the referrals, are apparently numbers over the period we're in lockdown going down or ceasing to come through for referral. That mirrors exactly within the learning field. So it mirrors exactly in terms of education, health and care plans. What we are now seeing is a spike in requests for education, health and care plans, and for those who ostensibly have social, emotional, mental health issues. And I think that is where one of the big words of caution are, because it's absolutely normal for some of our young people who have been through the situation and the context they've been in to have acting out behaviours, to be behaving in a way that is not conducive to potentially being in school with other young people. We've seen the reasons for exclusion
be extended that also include COVID related issues. So we've got all of that agenda going on, and we need to be really careful, I think, when we are looking at the support that needs to be put in place for those learners. Because what we are not seeing at the moment within learning is this massive rise in requests for support that are below the education, health and care level, you know, at a level where we're actually talking about early intervention, where we are talking about putting support in from service that prevent difficulties rising. And I think that is one of the concerns that we're seeing within learning, that we are not seeing that. And when we have started to look at that more closely, one of the potential reasons for that is because we haven't got all of our young people back in school. We've got elective home education numbers rising within the city where learners haven't returned to school from the lockdown. And we've also got numbers in schools where normally there would have been requests for support or support from the Area Inclusion Partnerships, and we are not seeing that massive rise. And the only way that we've started to analyse that is by looking at those young people who potentially haven't gone back into school, or may have attended for a period of time, but then bubbles burst and then back at home, then their attendance back in school is not as it should be. So I think there's a whole area there that engage those learners and have the conversations with the families that are restorative conversations to pull those families to feel confident and to get back into school and to support them. What we have done is increase all of our visits for those learners. So in terms of the elective home education children, we've pulled people from the attendance team, from learning inclusion teams, so that we can continue to have contact with all of those families, continue to have the conversation, continue to try get them back into school. We've done that also with the conversations we're having with schools where they're identifying learners that are returned and that do have this persistence absence difficulty. So again, we can work with the schools to try and identify, try and target, and again work with those families to get them back into school. Because I think what we talked about earlier, as school being that protective factor, is absolutely crucial. You know, if we can get young people back into school and they're attending, then we can start to have those conversations, you know, that are about, yeah, it's been really, really difficult, and these will be some of the things that you've experienced, the emotions that you have, some of your behaviours absolutely can be put in the context of it is a normal reaction to such a horrendous situation that they've been in, and then to be able to work with them to put plans and programmes in place. And I think that's, as colleagues, just quickly before I finish, with Jane and with Judy, what we are saying is the way we can do that is that integrated approach. It's about the prevention level, working with schools, whole school approach, ensuring that we've got that all in place within our schools, within our communities, and then the identification of those who may need more than that and may need something that's more individualised, whether it is an education, health and care plan or referral to CAMHS or whatever it is. So that is the work that we are now engaging with, which is very much how we have refreshed our SEND strategy, which is a real focus on the inclusion, the integration and the individualisation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Val. And Karen, did you want to come in on this as well?
Just quickly about the, you asked about the confidence in identifying specific groups. We're very aware that nationally that there is we're relying on our workforce to do that. And everybody is feeling exactly the same. There's a real fatigue, especially as we've gone into this second lockdown, and there's been a second spike, and then there's possibly further lockdown. So we are relying on the workforce. So that is being key, the well-being of the workforce. There is a real risk of burnout in our workforce across children's services and in schools and in health services. And schools have worked tirelessly from the very beginning, as have other services, to make sure that they are there to identify those children who are at the most risk. But there is a real risk to this. So our confidence in it, I have utmost confidence in the will and the drive to do this, but there is a real concern about the fatigue. The wellbeing work that we're doing from the DFE grant, a a lot of it comes from the Anna Freud Centre, and there's a big focus on staff wellbeing in schools and making sure that they're pushing for senior leaders to keep that staff wellbeing and for that to be of paramount, because it's through them that we're going to identify most successfully. But there is an impact, and as you've seen, 940 families have been affected by death following COVID in this city, and thousands of families have been affected in different ways, and that will be our workforce as well. So I think that just needs to be kept in mind. I am really confident in the will to do it and the aspiration to do it and the fantastic people we've got, but I would say I would be concerned about their well-being, and that's a risk because the impact is that they're not going to always be able to identify.
Okay, thank you for that. So I've got Councillor Bithell next, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Karen, for pointing out that concern around the welfare of staff. As somebody that works in school, I can absolutely echo how difficult it is in schools and how the staff really are struggling with fatigue. My point, however, is more about thinking forward, and in the interests of time this morning, if it would be easier for people to send it as an email, that's really fine than discussing it now. But I'm noticing anecdotally that there's a lot more exam stress, and it's starting earlier, which then gives it potentially the opportunity to get further up towards crisis as we move through. Now, I know schools are individually doing stuff in order to try and break that, but it would be good to know what, through this system, we are planning in terms of the exam stress and exam anxiety that young people are facing, and whether we're planning on putting it in early. Thank you.
Okay, Jess, would you like to come in first?
Yeah, I can take that. Thank you, Councillor. I acknowledge your point and I agree. We have noted the exam stress. I think it's really interesting that you have fed back what young people are also feeding back to us, that actually this is starting earlier, and there's a heightened level of anxiety that was caused by the exam situation last year that doesn't appear to have gone away very much, and it's being carried forward. We are, through our communications and our MindMate website, thinking forward beyond, obviously I talked about the Christmas campaign, moving into next year with regards to campaigns around exam stress, where people can find help, linking into available support within the city. Obviously there's all the work that's going to be going on in schools, which you've already acknowledged. I take your point about bringing it forward earlier, and I think it's really important that we do so.
Okay, thank you for that. Val, did you want to come in on?
Yeah, just to say that, as Councillor Bithell just said, we can certainly provide information of actually what's going into schools to support schools, because all of our inclusion teams, the ed psychs, well experienced in working with schools with exam stress. So yes, even more so within the current context, but it is an ongoing theme that we see, throughout the years. So there's lots of work that's been going on there and lots of plans, so we can get that to councillors, can send it on to you.
Okay, thank you for that. So can I bring in Helen Bellamy next, please?
Thank you. I wanted to say something about mental health of school staff, teachers and support staff. As a union, the NEU in Leeds, we've seen a real increase in the number of teachers and support staff ringing in with mental health problems. And what we are hearing is that they on the whole, they're happy with the procedures around COVID and how they're keeping people safe, or as safe as they can. But what is really tipping people over the edge is in schools where leadership are still insisting on observations, staff are being given long to-do lists, people being put on support plans out of nowhere. These teachers are absolutely working their socks off, and they're dedicated to these children and they want to do their best. And leadership ignoring the advice from Leeds City Council and from unions in some schools is causing massive problems, and it's taking up an awful lot of our time that could be directed elsewhere as union officers. You know, the link between schools and early help, as Jess said, you know, I know from my own experience in schools and through my own practice how, you know, I myself and many other teachers who I know have picked up on things that are happening in schools, particularly with families that are not yet on the radar. And that happens early on in schools. But if teachers' mental health is really not good, and if that is something that can be almost a quick fix, if that pressure within school that doesn't relate to COVID and is not necessary at this moment in time is removed, that will have a real positive impact on early help, intervention and children's mental health in classes.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Councillor Hazelwood, did you want to come in on this?
If I could just the point made about exams and exam stress with children in schools at the moment, just to pick up on Councillor Bithel's point and Helen's point there. We know that the children who are now in year 11 have missed a chunk of school in year 10 due to lockdown. They're now missing year 11 due to having to self-isolate, and some are missing more than others. There's a big disparity in children missing school at the moment. Some are in, some are out. We can't predict that. And we know that the Welsh Government have come out and said that there will be no exams in 2021 due to these factors, and they are putting obviously other strategies in place to assess children and young people's work. And we really do need the government in England to come out with some guidance and strategy on that, because we are having a lot of reports of exam stress of children and young people who have missed chunks of school and who are continuing. We don't know how that will pan out up until Easter. At least children will miss more school. And also we have children who can do work at home and other children who can't do work at home, and are more vulnerable children who can't do work at home for various different reasons. So we do need to get some guidance on this and understand where we're going with this. Otherwise we are going to see some children hugely disadvantaged when it comes to exam time in 2021. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you for that. And obviously, as you'll know, and it's in our work schedule, we did have a session looking at this. And as a result, myself and Councillor Pryor wrote to Ofqual and the DFE. And we've had a response from Ofqual, which we're sharing, and we're chasing up the DFE. So it's certainly something that's on our radar. So did anyone else want to come in on Helen's point? And I think Councillor Hazelwood's covered it quite well. So, okay, so we'll move on. So it's Councillor Illingworth next, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to ask about changes over the last 20 years. I can recollect the era described when there were enormous delays in any treatment and amazing gaps in the coverage, and I think that's now much better. But one thing that's gone over the last 20 years is the support from out-of-school activities, youth workers, sports clubs and so forth. I think now much reduced compared with some time ago. What sort of role do you think there is for the sort of non-professional worker, the youth worker, the person who is interacting with young people and doing useful activities, but not professionally trained in this area? Do they do more harm than good, or is it a good thing? Is it take the load off the professionals? Could you give me a feel for how important these external services are and their loss? Is that acute, or is that not a matter of concern?
Okay, thank you. I've got a flurry of people that want to respond, so I'll go in order of rank and bring Councillor Venner in first, please.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I do have a particular perspective on this, having always worked in the third sector, providing services that are both an alternative and a complement to statutory services. I think services that are outside of the NHS, outside the council, outside education are crucially important. They're obvious, they're often much more accessible and less threatening, in inverted commas, for children and young people to access because they don't have statutory power. I mean, there's a particular element within mental health services that probably for adults more than children, but people's experience of mental health services does include compulsion in terms of the fact that people can get sectioned and incarcerated against their will, and the fact that services operating outside the statutory framework don't have that power is one of the things that makes them more accessible. But similarly, services in the third sector that are for children and young people are more accessible because they don't have the power to remove children. So it's really, really key that there are services that are outside the council and education and the NHS that are both alternatives and a complement. They bring a different perspective. They're also sometimes more accessible for particular groups that have struggled to access statutory services. For example, people from Black communities, other diverse groups, the LGBT community. There are some really horrific episodes in the history of mental health services around the treatment of minority groups. It was only in the 1970s that being gay came out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as an illness, as a psychiatric illness. And in the same way, there have been some deaths of Black men in the criminal justice system. There have also been deaths of people who've been incarcerated in psychiatric hospitals, and disproportionately from minority groups. So there are lots and lots of reasons why services that are outside the system, as well as being part of the system, are really important. Within youth work, people will often talk to youth workers about things they wouldn't talk to teachers about. They're seen very differently. They have very different roles. And it's a huge loss that the period of austerity has meant that those services have been very depleted in many cases, because they are a really, really important part of the health economy. And actually, they save money if you can, in the same way within children's services, we invest in prevention so that children don't get taken into care. Leeds survival-led crisis services funded by the NHS specifically to keep people out of its services. It's much cheaper for people to be supported in community-based third sector services than to be in hospital beds. That applies to both children's and adult services. So for many reasons, because they're outside the system, because they're accessible, because they provide savings in human cost and human misery and financially, it's really, really important that there are services in the community and faith and third sector. And they've got a long, proud history, and I'm pleased to have been part of that. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you very much. It is really helpful advice as well as being welcome.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think there were a few others that wanted to chip in. Karen was the fastest with her hand up, I think. Karen Jessup.
I couldn't agree more with Councillor Illingworth. I think that you basically don't need an to make somebody feel like they've got a sense of control, a sense of worth, that they're accepted, that they feel safe, that they can express their emotions, that I can show warmth and responsiveness from anywhere, and anybody can do it and children, young people do it for each other. So I think there is something, we are absolutely embedded in having a relational approach, but that does not mean expert. Everybody brings expertise, and children, young people bring expertise in their own lives that they can share with other children, young people. We say in education, every teacher is a teacher of SEND. As far as I'm concerned, every person in Leeds should be focusing on everybody's well-being, including their own, and supporting it, and they can do that. They've all got a role to play.
Okay, thank you for that. Julie, please, and then Jane wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, I think it's got us all engaged in the conversation. Thank you, Councillor Illingworth. As Councillor Venner said, I spent 10 years actually working in the voluntary sector before I came into Leeds. So for me, the centrality, the value of what the voluntary sector, the community sector can do that we can, you know, as a statutory service, as statutory organisations, is absolutely invaluable. I think one of the things that we've talked about today has been some investment, you know, and continued investment that we're putting into, I suppose, what we call in workforce development. But really, that is about trying to upskill, you know, raise the confidence and awareness of workers right across the partnership, and included in that are our colleagues in the voluntary and the community sector. So they are absolutely central. We know when we're talking about you know, putting on training sessions, development sessions, offering consultancy as an example through some of the specialist coordinators, mental health coordinators who are based in the hubs. All of that is absolutely focused as much at the voluntary and community sector as it is in any other organisation. I think the other thing for me is that we can learn, and we have learned, you know, an absolute, you know, an awful lot from our colleagues, you know, in those local areas who know those communities well, who are able to engage with children and families in a way that actually sometimes we are not. So that's where the importance of that partnership, of sharing that information, and absolutely having them around the table is key, and that'll be an absolute focus as we go on with the plan, as colleagues have already said. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Julie. And Jane, did you want to come in?
Just briefly, just to say, absolutely. Austerity has stripped out a lot of the known services that would pick up kind of the day-to-day well-being, and absolutely shouldn't be relying on statutory services. And there is that expertise and that relationship and that trust that is there. So if I provide one example, so in one of our key priorities around health inequalities, and the first year, what we're going to be particularly looking at is children and young people from Black and minority ethnic communities, so some of the diverse communities. And public health colleagues helped us do a health needs assessment, which both looked at data but also met with different communities of young people to hear their experiences and their concerns in relation to mental health, wellbeing and access to services. And it was variable, of course, across the different communities, but a kind of overwhelming issue was about trust and accessibility, whereas there is trust and accessibility in local community groups, local youth groups, etc. So we're investing in a young person's community development type worker to be hosted by a third sector organisation that will then work with local community groups, local young people, to develop the offer, and that's complemented by access to grants for the third sector. So we're absolutely starting bottom up, recognising that that's the route to go in.
So thank you very much. I am delighted by the response I've produced. I wasn't expecting that, but thank you.
No, thank you, Councillor Illingworth. Okay, so Kate is next, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for all of the information that's been presented, and to obviously commend all of the work that's being done. I think it's just, you can't even express how important it is. My questions were just around a couple of the priorities. So the one around support for children and young people as early in the life of the difficulties as possible, and with the right person. In the slides that we saw, there was reference to, obviously because children weren't in school and weren't having perhaps access to some of the services that they normally would, that there was perhaps some missed opportunities for early intervention. So in relation to that priority, I just wanted to understand a bit more about what impact you felt that might have on some of those children and young people in terms of that delay in being able to provide the early intervention, and how that's being mitigated now, and and specifically in relation to that goal of being able to get in there early and with the right person and reducing waiting time. So I know we did touch upon waiting times earlier in a reference to information being on the CAMHS website in relation to that, but in reality on the ground, if we are now beginning to see an increase in referrals once children are back at school, how is that in reality affecting children and young people in terms of them being able to get that treatment as quickly as they need to and the right person? And then my other question was around the priority in relation to the impact of trauma. And obviously with lots of families, we know there's been trauma in their lives historically, previously. But for some families who are perhaps new, that perhaps difficulties have emerged during the pandemic, how will you assess the impact of trauma specifically in relation to COVID and the pandemic, and that being the source of trauma for those particular individual children and young people, as opposed to perhaps children who have had other difficulties, maybe already known to services with, past traumas. So I was just interested in understanding a little bit more about those two priorities. And then this is maybe a question more for Julie, with my sort of child protection solicitor hat on. I'm just interested as well in terms of what assessment is being undertaken in terms of the impact of COVID and mental health, the link between that and the rising number of children who are perceived to be at risk of significant harm. What's the correlation? Are we seeing an increase in numbers within the city directly as a result of mental health difficulties as a result of the pandemic? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Julie, do you want to start off on that one? And then I'll bring Jess in.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Thank you, Kate. So just in response to the specific question that you've raised there at the end, we've seen a shift in pattern in terms of contacts and referrals to our front door, so to duty and advice. So certainly when we were in lockdown, what we did see is a reduction in contacts and referrals from schools, as you would expect, really, given the school closures. However, we did see an increase in contacts and referrals from members of the public and from neighbours, members of the community who had particular concerns about children and about families. I think again that highlights that importance of community, and I suppose citizenship, and the communities being the eyes and ears, if you like, in relation to specific children and families. What we have seen is that being redressed. So I think nationally there was a concern, understandably, that as schools returned, that we would see a real spike, a real increase in contacts and referrals to the front door, and that could be overwhelming. It's reassuring to say, and I'm reassured to be able to say, that that's not been the case. We haven't had a spike or a huge increase in terms of contacts and referrals. However, what we have had an increase, back probably to the figures that we would have already normally have at this time of the year. But what we have seen is those contacts and referrals from members of the public reducing, and the referrals that we would have expected previously from schools to be higher. Within that, I suppose, in terms of patterns, the patterns that we're seeing in relation to the nature of the referrals or the presenting concern are around domestic violence and abuse, are around parental conflict. We certainly saw a rise in parental conflict during the pandemic and during lockdown, and I think that's where some of our local services, so we have a particular service in Leeds which aims specifically at parental conflict. We've got the Relationships Matters website. I think we've talked about that here previously. So certainly domestic violence and abuse, parental conflict, issues in relation to neglect, and poverty. And absolutely mental health, issues in relation to the mental health, both in relation to children and young people, but also parents and carers. I think in terms of COVID and the impact of COVID, I think it's fair to say we're learning, really. And again, I think that's where being open about that and talking about that in terms of the partnership, is pretty unprecedented. And whilst we know that there is learning from elsewhere globally, if you like, where there have been other crises, other pandemics, other issues that have impacted massively on communities and geographic areas, clearly there is an evidence base in terms of research there that we're well aware of. But I think it's right to say that we are learning, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that it is unprecedented times, and we are learning, and I think we'll go on to learn in the coming months and years actually what the real impact has been on children and families and communities. But suffice to say, that's where the partnership comes into its own, and all of the things that we've talked about this morning in terms of the multidisciplines and the different perspectives, and also really, really importantly, seeing and recognising and valuing young people, parents, carers, communities as partners, and their lived experience and their voice, and us being receptive to that and responsive to that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So Jess wanted to come in, and then Jane, please.
Thank you, Councillor Lamb. I'm going to leave the trauma question to Jane because I think she's best placed to answer that. I'm going to talk about the impact of referrals, and Karen might want to come in as well when I'm talking about the education element. So in terms of, just to clarify, obviously the numbers of referrals have gone up from where they were at the height of lockdown, but our referral levels at the moment are the same as they were for October and November 2019. So in terms of volume, we're at what we would say is normal kind of level of referral activity into our MindMate Spa. You asked about how it would impact on children and young people. And I think that impact is wide-ranging and is different for different children and young people. But in some way, I suppose we're talking about the needs at the point of identification could be greater than they would be if that young person was in school. And we've talked about schools as a protective mechanism. What I will say, and Karen can potentially elaborate, is that there has been a significant amount of work done by schools in the city to support vulnerable children and young people whilst they've been at home during lockdown and touch base with them. From a health perspective, we increased our communications during lockdown. So we pushed out a lot of information about where children and young people could access help and support, not just on the MindMate website, but by phone and text, daytime and nighttime. And we know actually through our figures that have been reported back to us for Cooth, which is our online counselling support, that was well used, and the Cooth service will continue to be very well used during lockdown. So there was still obviously some young people were accessing that support out there. We've increased our funding into the MindMate Wellbeing services, which is that cluster level support that are working in schools, obviously to address that push out that I talked about in the slides. And that offer is being shaped, and they are adapting, like Julie said, really learning as we go along and adapting their style of delivery, the amount of group work they're doing to help support schools in addressing that need that potentially is being identified at a slightly higher level than it would have been if school had been going on as usual. Karen's already talked about the Wellbeing for Education Return and the DFE funded work, a substantial piece of work that we're doing in partnership to support school staff and subsequently support children and young people. There's a significant amount of work being done with primary care as well, so that if families are presenting within primary care and GP practices, they're well linked into the support offer that we have. And just as a final point, as Jane mentioned very early on, we are in the development of a helpline and a crisis helpline to cover with 24/7 coverage for children and young people and their parents and carers as another area of support as well, so that if children do find themselves isolated and not being able to access school help if school is closed, there's another option of support there for them to access in addition to other wealth of options we have already in the city. I don't know if Karen wants to add.
Jess,
yeah, go ahead, Karen, and then I'll bring
comprehensive. Jane. I think just to add a couple of things, just to reinforce, there's an awful lot. I won't go through the list because I'm sure that you've had some of this before, but there's an awful lot of work that's been going on in schools around those identified children who are vulnerable, where there's been increased contact. Children and people who've got education, health and care plans. There's been risk assessments around if they weren't in school,
what the assessment around that was, and it's always done in conjunction with the parent carer, and if child young person is of a certain age, with the child young person as well. And we've had our SEND services and inclusion services open for business the whole time as well. Schools have been getting in touch and supporting on an individual level. What I would say is that, as we said before, is that there's a lot of response. There was a lot of response at the beginning, and there was a lot of people working very hard at the beginning, and a lot of duplication. And we learned very quickly that there was too much, especially for school staff. They were getting overwhelmed by it, and we took a slightly different approach. So we have learned as we've gone along, and we are probably not going to really find out around some of the impacts in terms of this, because there's a lot of research and evidence that's coming through around the impact when whole societies are impacted in this way. We've had some experience. There's quite a lot of research that we shared with our school leaders at the very beginning, when we did quite a lot of support at the very beginning to help them think through some of these aspects, to take some of the principles from huge disasters where there's been epidemics within countries, or where there's been significant disasters, and what's been learned from that. But even still, the principles underpinning it are probably very relevant, but this is so unique. So I think that we are going to, when this has moved on, and hopefully sometime in the future, in the near future, we'll be able to look back and actually reflect on some of the things we have learned, because I think that we will have got things wrong, and we will have got things very right, and there'll be a whole load in the middle as well. But I think that at that point, we will then have to think about how we are going to respond in terms of the societal impact as well around the mental health agenda. So the Future in Mind refresh, I think that what we're doing is trying to respond now, but it is flexible and it's dynamic and it can shift. Services have got those expertise and skills, and because it's across partnerships and with the third sector and with families, we're able to respond and within that strategy, I think, as well. So that is going to be crucial.
Okay, Jane, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, so if I can come in specifically about the trauma priority. So there's already, I suppose to say, there's already a lot of expertise in the city in relation to responding to trauma. So right across education, health and social care, and directly, as somebody, I can't remember who, sorry, in this meeting said earlier, many teachers, many staff in children's centres can already identify those who are experiencing some form of trauma from their behaviour within that setting. We recognise that, and what we are doing that's different is we're bringing together to make sure our offer is truly integrated. So that's, as Val was saying earlier, that's about how do we get the whole school approach, how do we get that integrated approach, the universal approach right, but then also getting that integrated formulation together when more targeted support is needed, and how do we pool our resources and our expertise and intelligence to be able to deliver that together so there is no confusion. In terms of the impact of COVID, so many things can obviously cause trauma. The known adverse childhood experiences identify direct abuse. And also, so there's the 5 categories, and then there's 5 that relate to kind of family dysfunction, loss and bereavement, etc. And then we know that there's also environmental factors, so discrimination, poverty, also impact on a child's mental health and trauma experience. But it's not deterministic. So as I think you'll have seen, there are protective factors, and it's something that we constantly go back to. So whether that protective factor is really positive relationships in school, positive relationships with grandparents, etc., all of these can mean that somebody with a similar kind of negative experience can be resilient because they have these strengths around them. So the way COVID can impact on that is, obviously, there could be experience of loss, bereavement. There could be heightened family conflict and witnessing of abuse. There could be the absence of that resilient protective factor. So if they can't see the grandparent, that's absolutely their anchor within that, then that's going to impact on them. So it's individual for each child, and we all have to work together to be able to respond and identify.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Okay, we're coming up on 2 hours on this, and fascinating discussion. So there's 3 more people to come in, and then we'll need to sum up on the session then. So I've got Jackie next, please.
Hi, I just a few comments more than questions, really. I welcome the strategy. What's wrong with this child changes to what happens to this child. What happened to this child? Because I think that's a good mindset. It is better, you know, on page 14. So I welcome that. And the whole family approach to mental health, going from think family to work family, working actually with the whole family rather than one person. I think that's quite a good strategy as well. Just to comment on the youth groups, I'm a youth leader for a youth group, and I also am a leader for basketball, and neither groups were able to, we haven't actually been able to open since March, mainly because of constraints of the pandemic. You know, a lot of we can't work with just 6 children indoors, especially now in winter, and that's just a comment to make so that people are aware that most groups haven't opened yet in that area. And I know we do good work when we're open, but we can't open right now. So that's one aspect of it. I just want to highlight one aspect of school and children, especially with my own family, because I'm actually going through it really. It's the constant isolation of children. For instance, my son, he's been, you know, on isolation quite a lot in the last month, especially. He's only been at school for 2 days because bubbles keep collapsing. I think the actual schools themselves, they're very good. He's in year 13, so at least, you know, he's doing A-levels, but they are very good at the learning aspect, and I commend school with all the hard work they're doing. I think teachers doing a brilliant job. They're going online, and they're also teaching at school, and I don't know how they do it. They deserve medals. But I think for the child, it is the mental health of actually going back to their friends for 2 days, for example, and then suddenly being on isolation again, and they having that one-to-one with their friends again. And I think that affects them quite a lot more than people realise, that they're going in out school 1 minute and then they're off again. I think it's quite a lot for them. But I think another comment I want to make about mental health, I think everybody on this phone call, we all have to look after our own mental health. Because if we haven't got our mental health, we'll pass it down to everybody else. So everybody look after your own mental health as well. Yes, we do have to look after everybody else, but if your own mental health isn't good, we're not good for anyone else. So keep up with it, everybody. That's my comments.
Thank you, Auntie Jackie. Everybody will take notes. Okay, I'm going to take the last 2 comments, and then I'll go around all of the officers and Councillor Venner and Councillor Heselwood just for your final comments and to respond to those points that come up. So Celia is next, please.
Thank you, Chair, and yes, thank you, Auntie Jackie. As some of us are well aware of being involved with Scrutiny Board for any length of time, not all schools in Leeds necessarily join in initiatives of the local authority. So I'm just wondering whether that is a problem or whether you're getting full involvement with the support that's available and very necessary for schools, and from the general strategy with the other partners, but in specific, I think, with the local authority. Also, some of the budget meetings I've been attending recently has made me more aware of the numbers of unaccompanied children sick, and that they may possibly rise. So are there specific intervention services needed for such children, and also in the wider group, the asylum seeker families and their children?
Okay, thank you, Celia. So if you hold those thoughts, please. And finally, I'm going to go to Councillor Renshaw, and then we'll go around all the officers. So, Councillor Renshaw. So I don't know if it's just me, I'm struggling to hear you, Councillor Renshaw. No, we're struggling a bit. Would you like to put your question or comment into the chat, Councillor Renshaw, and then hopefully someone can pick up the point as we're going around the summing up, just so we can keep things moving. Okay, so
better?
Oh yes, we've got you now. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's throwing a wobbler. Is that better?
Yeah, I think we'll crack on. So if you put your comment in the chat, please, Councillor Renshaw, and we'll try and pick it up that way.
It won't work in the chat today. Is that better?
I can hear you now.
Right. Sorry about that. It's just a comment that was made earlier about the youth service, and was it not for the local authority youth service in Ardsley and Robin Hood and the Outer South, we wouldn't have one delivered at all. And all throughout the pandemic, they've been doing outreach work with young people, even in the cold, horrible weather, taking all the precautionary measures that were required. I think we had 2 weeks when they were doing indoor work after going through all the safety measures to ensure that the building was safe and fit for purpose. And the youth service were in there just doing small group work with those most in need and with those with mental health issues who needed someone to speak to, with a maximum number of 5 when you aligned it to the size of the room. So I'd just like to give credit to the youth service and say, was it not for them in the Outer South, we wouldn't have a youth club. And I think people need to be aware that they are all professionally trained. So I'd like to thank the youth service. So if you can pass that message on, I think, you know, they do justice. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Renshaw. So there's a few points to pick up, and then as we go around, if there are any final comments that officers and exec members would like to make. And while we're doing that, if the board members could think, really, there's 3 questions that we need to answer at the end of the session. Priorities we would want to add, and 3, I think I know the answer already, but I'll ask it anyway. Do we want an update on the delivery going forward once the plan is approved and being enacted? So if people would think about that as we're going around the officers, and just put their comments in the chat, and then we can see if there's a consensus around those things. So perhaps if I can ask Karen Jessup to pick up those comments and sum up first, please. Yeah, you're on mute, Karen. There we go. You're very faint. We'll move on, and I'll try and come back to you if we can. So, Jess, would you like to make any final comments, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Just really to thank everyone for taking the time to hear about our Future in Mind strategy refresh and our impact of COVID work today, and for your contributions and insights. That's really going to help shape this work going forward. So big thanks for that. I particularly take forward the support that I feel that you've shared for our work around transitions and the importance of that. And I really welcome that. And just to pick up the point about taking our exam stress campaign and bringing that significantly forward. So just those final remarks from me, and a big thank you. Thanks ever so much.
Okay, thank you for that. Val, please.
Yeah, sorry if Karen's struggling with that. Would you like me to also just comment on the first part from what Celia was raising, rather in terms of the engagement?
Yes, please. Yeah, I'll come back to Karen then.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, Celia, thank you for that question. As always, full engagement of all schools, not always possible. We've had a fantastic response from the greatest proportion of our schools, and I think all of the bronze groups, the primary bronze group, secondary bronze group, and of course the silk bronze group, that have been, you know, throughout the entire period, where we have met with all those head teachers, where we've had that forum where we can raise issues, where we can do the problem solving, has been absolutely fantastic, because that hasn't just been about local officers, you know, giving advice or directives. It absolutely has been about jointly resolving some of the issues that are raised. So that has been great. As always, you will find, if I try to involve all of our schools, whether there are maintained schools or whether they're academy schools. So it's always an open invite to everybody that would like to join in those conversations, or indeed request support or help. So we don't differentiate in that way. I think, though, it's very fair to say that a lot of schools within their structures, within their own organisations, have had different levels of support. So in terms of resilience and their understanding around resilience, and often through a history of where they have dealt with critical incidents, they have a level of skill, a level of knowledge, a level of understanding, so they feel more confident to be able to manage and to cope with certain situations. So you will always get that. It's the same when we have critical incidents. Some schools need lots and lots of support, and other schools feel that within the house, within that community, they can offer that support. So it's different levels of confidence and different levels of engagement, but we have an open door to talking to whoever it is that would like to talk to us, and whoever, you know, would need some support or need some advice. Just in sort of finishing comments, I think the clearest thing for me, and the message that I would want to give and want to ask from counsellors, is very much that this is a strategy that is social, emotional and mental health. I know that a lot of the conversation has focused either on schools or has focused on individual intervention with CAMHS, but it is a strategy that stretches right the way across education, health and care, and that stretches also from that universal level, preventative level, into the very specialist and targeted services. And I think that is the message that I really want to reinforce and reiterate, that it is a joint strategy, and it's for those with also experiencing, particularly at this point in time, all of those social, emotional, mental health issues. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you very much, Val. So we'll go back to Karen again. Hopefully you're ready for us, Karen.
Sorry, it's IT fooled me then. I pressed the wrong button. I'd just like to reiterate to respond to Celia that it is difficult to get full engagement on a systemic level. And I understand that priorities for different schools can be different. However, we have got a huge number of schools who are really keen to be engaged with this, because they do understand what a significant role they play within it and how much they already do. We as a service, Learning Inclusion Service, and the EdSite team especially, are connected to every single school. So whether we have that, everybody can participate at the same strength and the same level, on an individual level, they are participating and engaging with us. So there are different ways for us to influence. And I know teachers really well. I was a teacher for 15 years. Teachers are engaging wherever you work. Teachers want to do this and they want to do it better. So I am absolutely huge amount of respect, but I am absolutely convinced that the teaching staff within the city, and I mean that in the widest sense, and our third sector will all be on board with it. I suppose I would just also reinforce what Val said, is that we are so committed to this being a social, emotional and mental health strategy. If it was a mental health strategy on its own, Jane would be writing it with Jess, and we would just be, we'd be supporting it. But we are really keen to make sure that everybody recognise that this is not a health issue. This is not a mental health issue for health services to impact. This is an issue for everybody. So we really welcome the questions and the comments from all of you to help influence and help us think about where we want to put the support, but also to make sure that we're not missing those children, young people and families who wouldn't go through a traditional service route, who are really difficult for our services to engage, and it might not be the effective way of doing it. So we want to make sure that we're supporting the mental health services alongside the wider services to really make a difference and improve outcomes in this area.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. So I'll go to Julie next, please.
Thank you, Councillor Lamb. I'll just respond to the 2 points raised earlier. So again, just in relation to engagement, and colleagues have already spoken about this with schools. I think we've seen tremendous engagement with our schools, with school leaders. You know, at the end of the day, partnership is something that we've got to continuously work at, you know, and I think we're all very aware of that. We do have, as colleagues have said, you know, those fantastic relationships with the clusters, with our targeted services leads, who are real sort of connectors, you know, in terms of schools, the clusters, the local authority. We've established the bronze meetings in the east, the south and the west of the city. So again, they are meetings that include school leads, police, health, the Volcom sector, to take a bit more of a strategic approach to issues that are emerging from the clusters. As Val and Karen have said, we've got the regular bronze discussions with school leaders, and that will all continue. You know, it's not something that we can ever take our foot off the pedal, you know, and that is true partnership, just to continue to build and make those relationships. And especially as we have new you know, head teachers, school leaders coming into the local authority, we need to constantly revisit those conversations. In relation to the question about unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, absolutely, you know, as you would expect, they have been a particular group of children that we've really focused on throughout the whole of the pandemic, and in particular in lockdown. You know, these are young people and children who, because of their own adverse childhood experiences, we know that there is trauma, you know, and so there's a range of services to, you know, meet those individual needs and those particular needs of those young people. In particular, we were very mindful, you know, that a number of those young people do live semi-independently. And absolutely, when we went into full lockdown, we ensured that there was increased support, contact with those young people, so that we could monitor their well-being. Just in relation to today's meeting, I've just thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to have the conversation. Actually, I think the conversation that we've had just really reflects the commitment and the passion, and I would say the ambition, you know, the ambition that we've all got to take the strategy onto its next level, you know, and in particular within the context that we're working, you know, and we know where that has been that impact on social, emotional and mental health. I think it reflects the partnership and the strength of the partnership, and I would just like to sort of, I suppose, really highlight that children, families, communities are central to that partnership, you know, and their lived experience and us listening to them and responding to what they're telling us. And I'll leave it there, Councillor Lamb.
Thank you very much, Julie. Jane, can I bring you in next, please?
Would be a bit like a broken record, because I think we're all saying the same thing in summing up, really. So I kind of opened up in my comments talking about the strength of the partnership in both developing and delivering the strategy, and that now informing the refresh. And hopefully it's been apparent to everybody how real that is. And it's absolutely essential in taking it forward to continue to build on that. also, I was smiling when Julie was saying about the centrality of children and young people's voices and families. Absolutely, that is core to what we're doing to make sure we do and choose the right things, as well as, of course, engaging with practitioners. And then I just wanted to thank everybody for such insightful questions and probing. Absolutely so helpful, and really adds value to our developments of the strategy, and would welcome coming back to report on delivery.
Thank you very much, Jane. So then if I can go to Councillor Heselwood for any final thoughts, please.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Lamb. I think, as Jane said, I think we're all saying very similar things, and Karen certainly said most of what I was going to say in summing up, so I won't repeat that. But just as Karen and Val have said, we do need to focus on the fact that this is a social and emotional and mental health strategy, and absolutely embed this within schools, and use our huge potential and talent that we have in schools to make sure that this works, and that we embed that. And so again, I won't repeat what other people have said, but I would just like to say thank you to all our teachers in Leeds who are working extremely hard through COVID. It is a huge issue in schools, the health and safety, but also identifying the children and young people in schools who need help at the moment, as we've talked about this morning, and who missed out on that help due to lockdown and schools being closed. And teachers are constantly at the moment having to catch up on that and working extremely hard to make sure that children are identified. So I think it's been a very valuable discussion this morning, and I'd just like to thank everybody for their contributions.
Thank you very much, Councillor Heselwood. So Councillor Venner then, please.
Thank you, Chair. Particular thanks to my ward colleague for his very interesting question that allowed us a number of us to talk about the value of the third sector. I think what's come out really strongly in today's discussion is the central importance of partnership and the absolute value of what's provided in statutory services, what's provided by the council and health and education, as well as by communities and the third sector and families themselves. Karen Jessup earlier mentioned the support children provide to each other, and I wouldn't want to understate that. Peer support is a really key element of services like the marketplace in terms of the support that children and young people provide to each other. Transitions has been quite rightly mentioned a number of times, and just to reiterate that this is a priority for the city, it's a priority in the all-age mental health strategy as well as our Future in Mind strategy. Just a couple of comments on trauma. Jackie referenced the move within services to what's happened to you rather than what's wrong with you. And I can't state strongly enough how revolutionary that change is. And I'm saying that as someone who's used mental health services as well as worked in them. Historically, when you approach mental health services with symptoms, what you tended to get was, well, there's something wrong with you that's medical, and and medication was often a response. And actually, it's a really big change to recognise that people's histories, and often histories of trauma, are what have brought them into mental health services. And with children and young people, it means you look at behaviours like self-injury or substance abuse and see them as meaningful responses to things that have happened in people's lives, and as communication that needs to be understood. And that's a really, really significant change. As Jane mentioned, that we for a while, for a long time, I think, had a good understanding of relational trauma, things like sexual abuse. What's becoming discussed more now are things like the trauma that is the impact of poverty. There's no doubt that the 10 years of austerity have caused trauma. I've seen that myself repeatedly in crisis services. And there are psychological impacts of the pandemic. There are children that are going to be traumatised because of the pandemic, and we know some of those impacts already. We know we're dealing with children who've been bereaved, who've witnessed domestic violence in lockdown. What we don't know yet are some of the longer term psychological impacts, like what's going to be the long term impact on toddlers who are being taught, growing and learning in a context of social distancing. So it's really important going forward, coming out of this extraordinary time and this period of global crisis, that we are responding in a trauma-informed way. What I haven't heard in this discussion is anyone saying the priorities are wrong. I know, Councillor Lamb, that was a particular question you posed, is for the board, is, are these the right priorities? It sounds as though they are, and we will really look forward to developing them and continuing to talk to you. It's been a just fantastic, rich discussion this morning, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Councillor Bennett. So, as you alluded to, there are three actions that we need to consider now. My sense, but I'll look for dissenters. Really, do we endorse the draft priorities as they are? If anyone thinks not, then now's the time to speak up. I'm getting thumbs up and nods, so I will take it that the board does endorse the draft priorities. The second question is there anything that we would want to add? Again, it doesn't feel that there's anything that's come up, but if anyone feels there's something missing, now is the time to put your hand up. And again, I'm not seeing anything. So, and the consensus from the comments is that the board would like to be kept up to date on the implementation of the strategy. So my question really for Jane and Councillor Venner is what you feel would be the appropriate time points for us to be checking in again to see how progress is going.
Well, it's due to be launched in April. So would you want us to come back before the launch or after the launch, when the strategy's being implemented for a number of months?
I think probably once it's in place. So perhaps
I thought so as well.
About a year from now, perhaps.
Yeah, that would be delighted to do that.
Okay, excellent. And is everybody happy with that? I know Councillor Renshaw has got your hand up. So you're on mute, Councillor Renshaw.
Yeah,
there you go.
I'm unmuted now. Chair, I'd just like to ask if some representation from youth services could be incorporated, as they're sort of dealing with a lot of the children who are in transition or going through the transition, and they also deliver services for the mental health of young people. So maybe it would be useful to have someone from youth service present.
Okay, are you meaning for when we look at this again to get some feedback from them?
Maybe before the feedback, but I do think it's an important element, because obviously it's not consistent throughout the city by the impression that I get, and we've had this issue before. So I do think it would be helpful, and then we could incorporate it into the full report, because it should be a way of working collaboratively so that there's a smoother transition for those young people and more directions in which they can turn to for help.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure that will be taken on board, Councillor Renshaw. Councillor Kidger, you've got your physical hand up.
Sorry about that. My thing's not working. I do apologise.
That's okay.
Yes, can I agree with Councillor Renshaw? In Morley South, we've seen such a fantastic support from the youth services. You know, and like Councillor Renshaw said, they're reaching out to these children and doing, you know, doing work, and we are preparing things to give them to do at home. You know, so it is a massive support that we're getting. And yes, please, if we could, I think it would be better before, if that's possible. But if I can just also say a massive thank you to everybody. The children in this COVID have really, well, we all have, but the children, I feel, have really struggled. And we've been hearing some awful circumstances, what's happening. And I'd just like to say to everybody, thank you. You know, I'm proud to be on this scrutiny. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Kidger. I think we'd all echo those comments. So if I could please thank Jess, Jane, Karen, Val, Julie, Councillor Heselwood and Councillor Venner, and everybody that's contributed. I think it's been a fantastic and really important discussion. I think it's fair to say the board wholeheartedly endorses the strategy, and we really look forward to seeing it being launched and implemented, and to hearing about how it's going next year. And if there's anything else we can do to add value or support to that, you only need to come and let us know, and we'll be standing ready to help in any way that we can. So thank you very much. So we move on now to item 8, which is the work schedule. So if I can hand over to Angela to take us through that, please.
Thank you, Chair. So this report presents the latest version of the work schedule for the remainder of this municipal year. So linked to this, board members are asked to consider and agree or make any further suggested amendments to the work schedule at this stage. The report also acknowledges that during the last meeting, board members had requested that the Scrutiny Board Chair and also the Executive Member for Learning Skills and Employment, Councillor Pryor, send a joint letter to the Department of Education and Ofqual relaying the views and concerns surrounding plans for statutory pupil assessment during 2021. A copy of this letter has been appended. You'll find this on page 57. And as the Chair mentioned earlier in the meeting, a response letter has been received by Ofqual earlier this week and has been shared with board members for information, and at the moment we are still awaiting a response from the Department for Education. So I'll pass back to you now, Chair.
Thank you very much, Angela. Any questions or comments on the work schedule? No, I'm not seeing anything. So, the final item is the date and time of the next meeting. Sorry, I've got Councillor Forsyth has popped her hand up.
I just wanted to highlight 4.3.2 on the report about climate emergency, which does actually flag up that influencing climate change and sustainability should be a key area of focus. I have no suggestions as to how that could be brought in, but going forward in our recovery from COVID, I just wanted to flag that up.
If you wouldn't mind me commenting, Councillor Lam, it does have a link to what we've just been discussing as well, that Anne and I have talked about before, that mental health services and schools and organisations working with children across the city and nationally have been experiencing, there's been a high level of distress in children about climate anxiety, I think it's termed. And it's been found that children that are climate activists don't suffer as much because they feel they have a sense of agency and they're doing something, but it's really, really key in terms of some of the anxieties about the world that children are experiencing at the moment. So within the context of what we've been discussing, it's a hugely important issue for children and young people.
Okay, thank you for that, and we'll certainly take that on board, Councillor Forsyth. Councillor Gruen, please.
Sorry, I didn't get to my hand quick enough when you said, would anybody else like to say anything? I just, in reference to the letter that we've now had a response from, I just wondered where we go from here. Presumably we're waiting for the Department of Education to get back to us, but in terms of any kind of reaction or response to that reply that we've had, how would you plan that we address that?
Well, we've given a gentle nudge to the DFE, just to remind them that we're awaiting a response. I thought the response from Ofqual was actually quite positive and interesting. One of the suggestions was that we might want to share that response with head teachers, and similarly if we get one from the DFE. So I'm certainly quite happy to do that. Other than that, I think we probably have to wait and see what further proposals come forward before we consider them again. So we've made our feelings known. So it's really waiting to see what the response to that is, I think.
Well, I would agree to share both responses with schools. I think that's sensible because at least they then know that we have been trying to do something about it. In terms of the response, yeah, it's positive, but it's rather inconclusive. So I hope that we'll hear more in due course.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Helen?
Hi, I'd just like to say that I'm concerned about in primary schools that the phonics screening tests are already taking place on the back of children having missed lots of school, and just concerned about, you know, SATs as well, you know, later in, you know, in springtime of 2021, because they obviously Ofqual are saying that you know, that's not really their area. So I think it'll be interesting, and also the publication of performance. I think it'll be interesting to read what comes back from the DFE on that, and whether we need to take further action in a response.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Well, perhaps I would suggest then, Angela, that we just put a brief item on the agenda for January, just to have a quick refresh as to where we've got to on this, and then we can see if there's any further actions we want to take at that point. Councillor Heselwood, you wanted to chip in?
Hi, yes, sorry, I've got a slight delay. I apologise. I've got a slight delay with my connection. I apologise. Yeah, I would just like to back up the comments that have been made. It's not just about, as Helen said, it's not just about GCSEs and A-levels. There are all sorts of other tests that go on in schools all year round, and they're all affected. You know, all children have been affected by this, and our concerns go across all of those statutory tests that take place. And absolutely, thank you, Councillor Lamb. I think putting this on the January agenda to see what response we've had from the DFE, because obviously we need to wait for that to come as well, and then we can take you know, action from there and decide where we can go from there. But I certainly would support, and I know Councillor Pryor would support, sharing out the responses with head teachers and with schools, so they know where we are as an authority with this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're at the end of our time. So we do have a working group meeting on Tuesday next week, and then the next formal meeting of the board is well, in 2021. So it'll be the 6th of January when we meet fully again in public. So if I can thank everyone again, it's been a really good session. I suppose it's the first time I've done this year. I will have to wish you a different but safe and happy Christmas. And for those of you that don't see next week, we shall look forward to seeing you in January. So thank you very much.